Is coming to you from the beautiful metaverse, and more particularly beautiful Danville, Illinois. And welcome to Midday with Reverend Don. And I'm very happy to have you join me for this lovely midday conversation. I love spending this time with you, and wherever you are watching this video, whatever platform you are on, you can type your comments or questions on that platform. They'll appear in my chat room and we can interact directly. And I hope that you will do so and that you will have questions and comments and that we will have a lovely talk. Today is Thursday. This weekend will be my first Patreon seminar. It's going to be on the subject of magic. If you would like to be part of that seminar, you can join my Patreon at revdonlewis.com under the seminar tier, or you could get a ticket at CorellianPublishing.com for $25. We're going to talk about magic. Right now, it's going to be a small crowd who already know the basics, which means we'll see where the conversation takes us. I suspect, tailor it somewhat to the people who are actually there and what they want to talk about. And hello to Jesse in the chat room. Good to see you. It's one thing when you're speaking to people who do not have a background, another when you're speaking to people who do. So we'll see exactly where it goes. I will probably cover all of the bases, but I suspect we'll talk about quite possibly the deeper end of the pool more than we might if I were, for example, talking to a class that whose background I did not know. And hello to Thorelius in the chat room. Good to see you, Thorelius. I've taught on the subject of magic for many, many years. And really it's something that you can talk about for a very long time and not begin to exhaust. So I think actually the problem is less what to include than how to narrow the subject enough to keep it within the bonds of the time period you have. It's very easy for a subject like magic to simply take over your time. And the next thing you know, the time is up and you haven't begun to speak to everything you could have said. And this, it's to be expected, I think, with that kind of subject matter. It's hard to get to everything when there's so much to get to. So when you speak to a subject like magic, or like the psychic arts, or like the soul and incarnation, and hello to Ravenwolf in the chat room. Good to see you, Ravenwolf. When you speak to a subject like this, unless you have a great deal of time, it's very hard to be exhaustive. You have to look at what you want to focus on and do that. Hello to Bradley in the chat room. Good to see you, Bradley. And there are always a range of things that you can, in fact, focus on. You can look at, with magic, you can look at the basics, you can look at the deeper issues, you can look at the existential nature of it, you can look at the very personal nature of it, you can look at the how-to of it, you can look at the unconscious side of it, which would fill a seminar in itself. You can focus only on the conscious side. You can put your focus in many different places, and that will determine what you're going to talk about. If you talk about the psychic arts, you can talk about the basics of psychic work. You can talk about the unconscious part of psychic work. You can talk about the many different practices of psychic work. And hello to Diane in the chat room. Good to see you, Diane. There are so many different ways you can approach it. There are so many different specific psychic arts. If you want to talk about different ways of pursuing psychic practice, that alone could fill hours. It has filled books. I mean, Um, you can easily have a book each on astrology, psychometry, palmistry, numerology, and many other psychic arts. So how can you speak to all of them in a single seminar? Well, you would have to present an attenuated version, which can still be valuable depending on how you're approaching it. And this is true, I think, of everything in life. At least every major thing in life, there are always different ways to approach it, which will give you a different view. When we talk about deity, for example, um, my point of view is that the nature of deity and how we interact with deity depends entirely on the point of view to which we're coming to deity from. And that this varies from person to person and circumstance to circumstance. Deity can be extremely existential and universal, or extremely personal and interactive. And both of these are accurate at that same moment. This is the essence of the idea of the diamond. The diamond in Correllianism is one of the major ways we look at deity. It's also a way we look at the soul, but it's really a way we can look at everything. Everything has many facets. And you can look at the entire stone and try to understand it existentially, or you can look at the facet and try to understand it in its particular aspects. And this is what we mean by evolution and involution. When something is spiritually evolved, and we're referring specifically to spiritual evolution here, it's dealing with that existential quality. Whether it's deity or incarnation or magic or the psychic arts or whatever, you're dealing with the whole picture when you're taking an evolved view of it. Whereas if you're taking an involved view, or some people would prefer to say evoluted and involuted, which I don't think are necessarily the best ways to put it, but I've been known to use those terms since evolved and involved can have other meanings. But if you take that involuted point of view, you're looking at the specifics of the moment. So if we were to talk about the psychic arts in an evoluted sort of way, we would be talking about how these are aspects of the soul that every person possesses. Everything in existence actually has at some level, and which are constantly operating in an unconscious level, but which we can learn to control consciously. Whereas if we look at it from an involuted point of view, we're talking about how to do palmistry, for example, or how to do astrology, how to do psychometry or clairvoyance. And this is, these things are both true at the same time. Yes, psychic arts are all of these things, but a psychic art can be just palmistry, can even be aspects of palmistry. And these are both important to look at. And Thorelius in the chat room says, a nebulous subject is problematic. Mongrelization always comes about. Read something like the books on a history of magic and science. Even people like Newton spoke to something that was always around. And Oppenheimer was part of a more nihilistic tradition. Okay. Very cool. So I'm not there's a whole conversation in that comment. But continuing with what I was saying about evoluted. Oh, and hello to Carlin in the chat room. Good to see you, Carlin. And if we look at, I think, any subject, there are different levels we can look at it from. And I'll give you an example. This weekend we have Lord Don's Library of Horror with myself and Cosmo Rubiconis, and we're doing the film Metropolis. And we have a little more commentary than usual on this film because there's so much to say. But if you look at that commentary, you'll see we approach it both from a kind of existential level and some very individual levels. as well as internal levels versus external levels. So for example, at an existential level, we talk about the fact it's a silent film. Silent films bring certain things with them for the most part. All silent films carry with them, with the exception of one or two that were very unusual, they carry with them the fact that by modern standards, they tend to be overacted. And this is because, Bradley says, I got my popcorn ready. I'm sure you'll enjoy it. It's considered a great classic and it's quite interesting in many ways. But with silent film, they did not have the words. So to borrow a phrase from Sunset Boulevard, they had faces then. They didn't need dialogue. But that's exactly what they did. They used their faces and their gestures in an exaggerated way to fill in what words could not provide. And even though they used intertitles to supply some words, it couldn't begin to be enough to use that as your primary storytelling agent. They had to use the expressions. But in modern cinema, of course, you don't do that. You're being much more subtle because you have all these different elements they could not use, including both words and more intentional scoring of the film. Because although certain silent films had scores written just for them, they did not all, and there was no guarantee that score would be used when it was played. Many theaters, in fact, most theaters had their own organist there who might or might not follow a preset plan. And so you really couldn't necessarily control that aspect. So that too was not something they could do. This just comes with being a silent film. Now in Metropolis is also a morality play. And the exaggerated performances of the actors may also have to do with the fact that they're not really playing characters, they're playing principles. And so they may be exaggerating them even more than they might have done otherwise to try to stress that aspect. I don't know that to be true, but it's a possibility. And this too is part of the existential nature of silent film. Another aspect of films of that era that is existential is if they're trying to forecast the future, they're forecasting the future based on what they knew then. And that did limit to some extent their ability to see what was coming. It's been pointed out about far more recent science fiction films than Metropolis that all kinds of things that we have today, they're not showing in farther futures because it didn't dawn on them that they would have such things, that such things were going to be developed. That's certainly true in Metropolis. Metropolis is definitely a 1920s view of the future. That does not, in my opinion, take away from it. In fact, in my opinion, it adds to it because I kind of find it fascinating to see what they got right and what they got wrong. But that is something that is existentially part of the nature of this sort of film. Now, if we want to talk about particular aspects, so hello to Maggie in the chat room. Good to see you, Maggie. If we want to talk about more specific aspects, we could talk about individual scenes like the transformation scene and how it was filmed, which we do in fact talk about in the broadcast. I'm not going to do that there because I don't want to give away that aspect of what we talk about. But I will say that one of the things about that scene is considered absolutely revolutionary, absolutely classic, and no one knows for sure how they did it. Partly because people who worked on the film told different stories about how they did it that don't go together. So you have to wonder, did they film it multiple ways and some were discarded and others used? Did they film it multiple ways and kind of merge them all together? Or did people make up stories that they thought were interesting? There's no way to know because there's no one living now who was on that set. Because Metropolis was just under 100 years ago. For the time, these special effects were absolutely amazing. But how did they do them? Some of them are obvious, some of them not. One of the things I find fascinating about Metropolis that is not in the film, and I don't believe we talked about it in the broadcast, but there's a famous photograph that shows Birgitta Helm in her robot costume between takes, and she's taken off the head, and she's sipping from a drink with a straw, which is not a surprise, but someone is standing there with what looks to all the world like a modern electric hairdryer, blowing it into the neck of the costume. And this was an air gun meant to cool the young lady off, to help her deal with the heat of this costume in this set. I did not have any idea they had that in 1927, 1926. We're talking basically the year my mother was born. I thought that sort of apparatus came much, much later, but no, there it is. It just was not in use as a household item. And I don't think it was being used as a beauty supply item at that time. It was an industrial item. But, you know, you could take it right out of that photo, put it in a modern store, and nobody would notice that it was unusual, because it would not be. Another famous thing from the 1920s, there was a big time travel brouhaha for a little while about a piece of film that showed what appeared to be a woman talking on a cell phone in the back of a famous silent film that had always been there, and apparently no one had ever noticed. And there was a lot of back and forth about what this could possibly be, if not a time traveler using a cell phone. Now, the eventual answer that people came to was that it was a piece of forgotten technology that was actually a hearing aid, which is why she was holding it to her ear. And it was a state-of-the-art hearing aid for that time, which has been forgotten because of the nearly invisible hearing aids people have used since. But, you know, it's an example of things that a person of the time would have recognized. There's another one, and I realize I'm rambling a little bit, but hopefully you're enjoying it. There's a photo where people are speculating, oh my God, it must be a time traveler because he's wearing modern clothing in the 1940s. Because there's a person in this crowd wearing a basically ordinary t-shirt and jeans. To get there, you have to have forgotten the 1940s, but of course, very few people are still here from that era. That actually was not an unusual costume for that time. It just was not dress clothing. And lots of people went around in t-shirts and jeans at that time, but they're not usually in the photos that have been preserved. So we have to be careful what we read in to certain situations that was never there in the first place. So as we consider these things, we also have to remember that. Another really interesting one that takes on a whole different meaning if you know the details versus if you don't. There was another brouhaha about an astronaut in the carvings of a famous cathedral. And how could this have been there in a cathedral built in the 13th century? Obviously, there was a time traveler or aliens or something. Except that isn't what happened at all. There is a custom when these ancient cathedrals have to be repaired or expanded upon to include modern references to keep them part of the contemporary world. So yes, there was an astronaut in the carving, but he didn't date to the 13th century at all. He dated to the 1960s or 70s, and that's why he'd been included. But if you didn't know that, you wouldn't think that. People just made the assumption nothing had been added since it was built. So you also, in examining something like this, have to think about what you might not know. And Ravenwolf says, wasn't Metropolis the giant robot? Metropolis was arguably the first real film about a robot. She wasn't a giant robot. And she was also the inspiration for C-3PO. The robot in the film Metropolis is a woman robot who is given the semblance of a living woman and becomes what I guess we'd call an android, but she begins as a robot. And the costume, which apparently was incredibly uncomfortable, is very similar to the 3CPO costume. She's had a lot of names she's been given over the years, including Parodi, uh, Futura, Metaluna, and others. But and I believe in the novel she was given the name, both the names Parodi and Futura. Parodi meaning parody. Um, the great film historian Forrest Ackerman called her Metaluna, which is the name I was introduced to her through. And artistically, it was a great triumph. For the actress, it was apparently hell on earth, to the point that she refused to ever work with this director again. Um, but there are also other aspects to that story, including the fact the actress was only 16 years old. Part of the reason she got the job may have been that being so young, she was also so slender that she could wear this robot costume without its looking bulky. Which, if you remember the story of Star Wars, is also part of why I believe Peter Mayhew played C-3PO, and part of the reason he got that job was that he was so slender that he could wear the costume without making it look bulky. Because at that time, all they could do was a costume. Having an actual automaton was beyond what they were able to do. And Ravenwolf says Warwick Davis, I think, was R2, and he may very well have been. I certainly knew at one time, but it's been a long time. I do remember when Star Wars came out, and I remember going back to watch it, I think 3 times, which people were going back to watch it 10 and 15 times, which was unheard of in those days. You didn't normally go back to a theater to watch something multiple times, except for the very best movies. But people were going back to watch Star Wars again and again because it was so revolutionary and had so much detail that people just were doing that. Even I did it, and I didn't normally go to theaters. But I had gone to see it, and it was that good in the theater. It would be almost impossible to explain it to a young person today in a way they could fully understand, because so much has changed in those years, including where you see movies, how you see movies, and it really is a very different world in that aspect. But C-3PO is one of the major legacies of Metropolis, actually. And there are many others. But it's a very interesting film to watch. So I hope you'll watch Lord Don's Library of Horror this weekend on Pagan World TV. And I think that you'll find it well worth the watching. I think you'll find the commentary very interesting. And again, in that commentary, we approach it both existentially, in its characteristics as a silent film, and more specifically in terms of aspects of the filming and the performances, and even the lives of the actors, because each of the major figures in the creation of this film, which was shot during Weimar Germany, had to deal with the rise of Nazism. And they had a front row seat, and how each one of them dealt with it is a very interesting story that we talk about. Fritz Lang, the director, was considered technically Jewish. Birgitte Helm, the lead actress, was severely troubled by aspects in her life, but she was also Adolf Hitler's favorite actress. Thea von Harbou, who was the writer, was very, very popular in the Nazi world, but each one of them had reasons why that was not good for them and how they dealt with it is very instructive for how people can deal with such situations. Or at least if you have the money to do the things they did. Many other people did not have that freedom and were not able to take that kind of action. But each of these three people took interesting actions, some more praiseworthy than others, but very worth the learning about. You know, I have to, we're almost at the end of our half hour, and I have to mention a book that I believe I have retained in my library, I hope so, called Blood and Banquets by Bela Fromm. And Bela Fromm was a Jewish journalist in Weimar, Germany, who also had to deal with the rise of Nazism in Germany. Eventually was obliged to flee the country. And the book is the story of her life to that point. She wrote it shortly after resettling in the United States, where she rebuilt her career, but never obviously as well as she had been established in the first place, because English was not her language. But actually, some aspects of this story are in that autobiography. She speaks about these scandals and the eventual fall of Birgitta Helm, as well as many other interesting things that happened. So if you ever have a chance to read that book, I highly recommend it, because you'll find things in there you're not going to find elsewhere, in part because the lady had a unique vantage point to see these things as they were happening. There's another very interesting book about the rise of Nazi Germany called Mask of the Swastika. I cannot remember the name of the author, nor am I certain that I've retained it in what's left of my library, but I will always remember what's in it, whether it's there or not. But this was a collection of sketches written by a German Jewish man who had been obliged to resettle in the United States. He had to flee Nazi Germany. But after the war, he went back to Germany to interview the non-Jewish friends that he had known before the rise of Nazism and see what happened to them and how they coped with it. And the people he interviewed were a wide range of German society, some of whom embraced Nazism, others of whom strongly opposed it, one of whom ended up in a concentration camp, at least one. He changed their names, so exactly who they actually were is a little harder to say. But their stories are very interesting too, and they ranged from the wealthy, entitled fashion designer who was a friend of the family to one of the family maids, and how these different people had coped with that situation as it unfolded. Those he was able to find, those who were still alive, is very interesting reading. So I would recommend that book if you ever have the chance to read it. So this has been a bit of a rambling half hour, but I think some interesting points. We started with, I think, a deep philosophical point, the difference between involution and evolution. And this week, we've dealt with some pretty heavy subject matter. We dealt with some deep subject matter dealing with the Juneteenth holiday. We dealt with some deep subject matter regarding the solstice. We've dealt with some deep subject matter today. So, some days we have just light, casual conversations, and sometimes we have deep subject matter. I hope you're enjoying all of it. I am. And again, I love you all. I thank you for being here. I love this time I get to spend with you. And I particularly love the interaction that we're able to have through the chat room. And I'm looking forward to the day when that can become video interaction. So thank you all, and let us close as we commonly do with our prayer. Divine Mother Goddess, Divine Father God, beloved ancestors, we ask you to help us to keep our view flexible and to see things from many angles, and to realize that no one angle truly encapsulates everything there is to see. but rather it is the synthesis of many different views. And help us to realize that any one angle can be seriously skewed, and that we must always keep learning and keep looking at things in new and different ways to truly understand them. Divine Mother Goddess, Divine Father God, beloved ancestors, we thank you for your presence in our lives, and we know you are always here, but from respect, we thank you. And until next time, may you blessed be. And I thank you, I love you all, and until next time, may you blessed be. Blessed.